Let's take this dull, mundane, architectural / real estate photo and turn it into this using nothing more than Lightroom. Hi guys, welcome to a real estate post-production tutorial in Lightroom. Today we're going to be looking at how we can effectively, excuse the expression, polish a turd. I was on site shooting this property and the conditions weren't great, unfortunately couldn't be avoided, but here we go, we've got to now make this look good. So how do we do it? First of all, you want to make sure that your profile is set to something that is camera specific, nothing generic if you can help it. So scroll down and you should be able to find something like the flat profile or neutral. This is going to depend on your camera brand and what they've supplied to Adobe, but I prefer to work from a flat profile or as flat as you can possibly get it, i.e. limited contrast, because we're going to control the contrast ourselves, and by choosing a flat profile we have a greater dynamic range as a starting point for us to begin our edit, and that's a good thing. So straight away, if I press the backslash key, we can see our before, and straight away after, all of a sudden we've got more information to work with. Less contrast, but more information. The next thing we want to do is set an appropriate white balance. So I'm going to choose the eyedropper tool here and just come over to where we've got a little bit of shadow underneath the white linear board here, because basically if I click here, that's going to give us a more neutral color balance. If you're not happy with it, you can just resample until you find an area where you think that's an appropriate color balance. For the best results, you just want to look for an area in your photo that you can sample from that is a neutral color, a neutral gray. I'm going to come back to this section very soon, but for me, one of the biggest things to get your image looking right is to apply lens corrections and also make sure that your vertical lines are actually parallel. So let's do that now. First of all, let's come into the lens correction section here, and we're just going to turn on remove chromatic aberration, which is going to get Lightroom to get rid of any fringing that we may have around the edge of objects. Let's zoom into 400% and we may see this just a little bit better, and you can see to the left edge of this tree here we've got a little bit of magenta going on, and to the right edge of these leaves here you've got some cyan. That's going on over the whole picture, and if we click remove chromatic aberration, Lightroom's effectively got rid of that, so that's great. So you don't really notice that from a zoomed out perspective, but it's certainly going to help clean up your image, particularly when you're zoomed in. Now the next thing we're going to do is enable profile correction. And what that's going to do is tell Lightroom that we want to use a profile correction that is specific to our lens. In this case, I'm shooting with a 16 to 35mm f4 lens. It is not a tilt shift lens, hence the reason that as I'm photographing this from almost eye height, I'm having to tilt up towards the property, and that is causing the conversion, the keystoning of the lines here, pulling up towards the top point there. And we're going to correct that in the next step, no worries. But for now, we just want to be aware of the fact that any barrel distortion has been corrected. So in this focal range within my lens, which is 24mm, it's barely noticeable, but certainly when you're shooting at something like as wide as 16 or 18mm, you're certainly going to notice a lot more barrel distortion, maybe pin cushioning on the other end, and Lightroom's going to correct for all of that, which is great. And also any vignetting around the edges, just by turning this on, that darkening around the edges that you get with pretty much every lens, Lightroom just corrects that. So the next thing we're going to do is jump into transform, and this is my favorite bit for correcting for architecture and real estate photography. Just select your guided option here, because I feel that you do a much better job yourself than Lightroom does with its auto corrections. And then just look for a straight edge, or what should be straight, at the very edge of the right hand side of the frame, and you're going to click once on a point and then drag down and release along that straight edge, and then come over to the left hand side and again look for something towards the edge of the frame. You don't want to be correcting by putting two lines very close to each other. There's too much margin for error. So the further you can get these points apart from each other, the more accurate this is going to be. And so I'm just dragging down the edge of this window frame here, and just like that we have a vertically corrected image. Doesn't that look so much better? If I do the before and the after, already we're in a much better place than what the raw capture was. Okay, now we want to sort out our exposure and our contrast on a global level. So we're talking about the whole picture here. We're going to make some more refinements that are specific to certain areas, like underneath here it's very dark, so I want to draw attention and brighten that up, but we'll do that using Lightroom's masking features shortly. So first of all, basic panel, come in here, we're going to grab the exposure slider, bring that up slightly, And we're also going to grab the contrast and boost that up just a wee bit. We can finesse the contrast using the tone curve, but I like to just introduce just a little bit just to get things moving along the right direction. And the highlights, I normally find for my camera, the best thing to do is to actually reduce the highlights and bring the shadows up, and that's just going to start bringing in information in these darker areas. You can see that if I push that all the way to 100, all of a sudden, even though we've got this bit of a nasty faux HDR look going on, we've certainly recovered a lot of that shadow information. And how far you take that is up to you. I don't like to go too far with it, but it certainly helps to push a little bit into those shadows, and like I say, also drop those highlights down. I don't like to be too aggressive with these sliders because, as you saw, things do start to get a little fake looking, and we don't really want that. The next step that we want to do is make sure that we have a full distribution of tonal values from the very darkest blacks all the way to the very brightest whites. Currently, you can see on the histogram here, the left hand side represents the shadows and the black point. We don't actually start at the edge of the histogram, but by grabbing the black point, we can actually drag that down until we start to actually meet pure black. And ideally, you've got a good quality monitor that is well calibrated, that is going to visually show you this on the screen, but sometimes it's hard to see. And the best way to actually get a representation through Lightroom is just to turn this little triangle on here by clicking it, and that basically is going to give you a warning. When you push these blacks to the left, all of a sudden these blue areas are saying, hey, I am pure black, I've lost all information here. And so you want to bring that slider to a point where you're just starting to see some little specks of blue in there, and those areas are going to be pure black. So that -24 point is good for me. And we can do the same with the white as well. So if I grab this point and start bringing it up, if I push it all the way to the right, you can see that we've now got pure whites here, but we don't have a warning for it. So again, we can either hover over this little triangle here, which shows us the highlight clipping, and all of that red area is pure white, blown out to pure white. You don't want that, but we can click this so that it's permanently on, and now we can actually drag that slider down, and where we just start to see those reds occurring, that is where we're now at pure white. Everywhere else, we've got information in this file. So I'm happy with that, and I'll turn those off. So let's just see a quick before and after just by resetting the tones there. And if I come to my history here, and I can just switch between the two. So this is with all that contrast introduced and all the changes we just made. This was without those changes. It's a much flatter file. So just by making those shifts in the contrast, highlight, shadows, whites and blacks, we've got a much better visual foundation for this photo. Let's talk quickly about the present section. My favorite slider in here is the clarity slider. This works really well for architecture. Now I'm going to push this to +100 just so we can see what it's doing. And as you can see, it's introducing a lot of local contrast. We've got a lot more depth through here in terms of the contrast variation between whites and blacks locally, but it's too strong. It's far too much at the moment. So as I slide this back and forth, you can see how it's affecting the building, it's affecting the gravel as well, and that might not be what we want. We don't really want to draw attention to the gravel, more so just the building. So I'll double click to reset that, and the vibrance as well is a good slider to play with. I feel like because this is a flat overcast day, we're certainly going to reap benefits by actually bringing the vibrance slider up. I don't want to take it too far, but I'm going to take it probably further than I normally would, just so we're giving this photo just a little bit more life here. So with regards to the clarity slider, because I was saying I don't want to apply this everywhere, and I certainly don't want it that strongly, what I'm going to do is actually start applying this with local masking. And local masking is, if you guys don't use it, it's something that's so powerful. You have to incorporate this into your workflow. Lightroom has recently had an update which has changed the way the masking works, but when we come up here, we can see that we have a lot of options for our masking, which can seem a little daunting, but when you get your head around it, this is a real game changer for your editing. You can take the adjustments that you make via the local masking section really far if you want to, but it's a good idea just to have an idea of roughly what you want to do before you start, and then be specific with that masking. So for me, a couple of things that I would like to do straight away. I would like to certainly bring attention to this darker area under here. Obviously, because there's an overhang of the roof, things are much darker in here, and this is the entranceway to the home. It's a feature. We want to bring attention here. I'm also disappointed with the sky at the moment. It's pretty grey and lackluster. And yes, absolutely we could do a sky replacement in a tool such as Luminar or in Photoshop, but I'm going to stick with Lightroom for this edit just so we're all in one place, and I'll show you what we can do there. So we're going to work with the sky. I'm also going to create a slight gradient just to draw our eye in towards the property, and that clarity slider that I talked about before, we're going to apply that locally and just to the property itself. So first things first, let's start with this little area under here. So we'll kick things off with a radial gradient here, and I'm just going to click in the center of the area I want to affect and drag an oval out. And I always drag bigger than the area I want to affect, because what I like to do is just taper the effect off. And if you can get a nice transition from that center point and it feathers off, you can see my feathers set to 100. That represents a really nice smooth transition from the effect that you're going to create to none of the effect at the extremity of that oval. And then it just blends in so much more seamlessly. So what I'm going to do is just boost the exposure up, and you can see if I take this quite far and get really aggressive with this, you can see that we can brighten this area up, and you can see that it just tails off towards the edge of that oval. So obviously that's far too much, but if we just boost the exposure to a point we're happy with, something like, I don't know, plus 1.3, and grab the shadows, and now we're going to bring those up as well. And all of a sudden we've got some good detail through here. Sometimes when you bring your shadows up, you start to lose your black point. It pushes that up quite high. So you can just control that by bringing the blacks down. And we'll bring our contrast down just slightly, just so things aren't getting too contrasty and still blend in with the rest of the scene. But right now you can probably see that the timber here has gone quite orange with those adjustments. And so we're just going to bring the saturation of that down, so that it ties in better with the wood that we've got in the rest of the property that we can see. And we may just want to bring a little bit of clarity in. You can see that that local contrast being reintroduced. If I push that up, I just want a little bit. And once we've made those changes, if we feel like we've been a little too aggressive with this, and I'll move it away from the area and then back over so you can see what it's doing. If you feel like you have gone just a little bit too far with it, that's okay, because what we can do is come over here, and you see this arrow here. Not many people know about this one, so press on this arrow here, and all of a sudden we have access to this magical amount slider. We can increase it, and we've got more of that effect going on, but it was sat at 51. We're going to bring this down. We can just reduce that to about 34, and that's much more believable. And while we're dealing with radial masks, I may as well do the one for the clarity adjustment as well. So I'm going to come over here and click create new mask, select the radial mask, and I'm going to click in the center of the property and drag out. And I'm dragging an oval that I want to cover most of the property. And because the angle of the property kind of slopes down here, what we can do is click outside of the oval and hold and drag that down. And that's going to allow our radial mask to better match the angle of the property. And because just before I changed to the amount slider here, I need to re-click this arrow here, and that's going to give me access to all my adjustments again. And this is where I'm going to come down to the clarity slider, grab that, and I can bring that up. And you can see now that I'm able to introduce more clarity, but it's just affecting where that oval radial adjustment is. So I'm just going to bring that down to a point where I feel I'm happy with it. So now we've applied those two masks, what we can do is come to the little turn off masks toggle button here, turn that off to see our before, and turn it on to see our after. And that's just two simple radial adjustments, and it can make a big difference. So the next thing I want to tackle is the sky. It is very tepid, very washed out. So what we're going to do is click create new mask, and this is really cool. We've now got an option to select sky. We click that, and Lightroom's going to do a calculation, work out where it thinks the sky is, and once it's done that, we're going to have access to a pretty accurate mask, which you can see here now denoted by the red overlay. You can see that we've got a slight bleed going on over the property here, which could cause us problems. I thought it was going to do a better job than it has actually, but we can always use the erase feature just to get rid of this area here. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to leave that mask exactly as it is and just start playing with it so that we can see what we can do. So I can bring the exposure back in line with the rest of the photo just by dropping that down, because obviously the brightness value of the sky is always so much higher, and the fact that we can isolate it now with that mask and bring that exposure down, that's brilliant. The next thing that I'd say is really quite useful sometimes with skies is if it is just looking a little bit grey and flat, a really quick fix is to actually grab the temperature slider and just move that towards the blues. Obviously my preferred method is to do a proper sky replacement, like I say in Photoshop or Luminar, but this is an adequate solution inside of Lightroom. But we can finesse things as well. If you find like you've taken things just a little bit too blue and things looking too cyan, you can introduce a little bit of magenta. Just get that color as you would like it, and then what you can do is come to the saturation and just drop that back, ease it back to a point where you feel like it's just a little bit more believable. Because our sky is isolated, we can do further adjustments as well. We can pull the highlights down a little bit, we could bring a white point up if we want to, and if you have a lot of clouds and you want to make a more dramatic shot, obviously we could grab the clarity slider and start bumping that up. And then just like we did before, if we feel like this is just too much, but we don't want to come back and individually change each of these sliders, we can just come to that overall effect amount and just bring this back to a point where we feel like it's just a little bit more believable. I alluded to the fact that you can go really deep with masks if you want to, and because I'm feeling like this sky dropped in behind the house here, it's not as believable as I would like. I'm going to try doing something a little more with the masks, and so this may work, it may not, but basically I'm going to try duplicating this mask. So this is the sky mask that was made before, it's duplicated, and now what I'm able to do is come in and make more adjustments. So currently we've compounded the effect of this mask twice. We've done it once and then we've done it again, and this isn't the look I want here, but I do want access to the mask. So I've duplicated it, and now I'm going to hold the Alt key and just click reset. And now everything's gone back to normal, and again I see my overlay of that mask until I make any adjustments. And what I want to do is just brighten up the area around the house here, and then it's going to taper off almost like a vignette towards the edge of the frame. And initially when I do that, that's going to apply it to the whole of the sky here. So let's just bump the exposure up. You can see that the sky suddenly got a lot brighter, but I only want to sort of apply it just around this kind of area here. So let's get the look we want just by increasing the exposure, maybe pulling the highlights back slightly, and maybe even just desaturating it a little bit just so that blue's not so vibrant and in your face. Okay, now we're going to get a little bit more detailed with the masking. So I have my overall mask here, which we can see. What I want to do is take these changes that we made away from the edge round here, so it's going to reveal that original mask underneath. So we're going to click on this mask here, and that's going to give us options to either add to the mask or subtract from the mask. In this case, I want to subtract. And there's a few ways you can work with this, but we could brush it away, or in this case, I'm going to start with a linear gradient and just click at the top and bring this down as a transition. So now we've got none of the effect at the top anymore, and it fades in through this. So you can see the change that is made to the mask over here. As I hover over that, it's revealing that red area, which is saying this is the area that's affected, and you can see that we no longer have the area at the top affected. We can also subtract with the mask with the brush if we want to, so we could add another subtraction, adding another subtraction. So it's getting complicated. It sounds complicated, but it's not. We're just saying I want to take away what I'm going to paint with this brush now. So that effect that I've done here, which was boosting the exposure, that's the main thing. We've brightened things up. I'm going to take that brightening away from around the edge of this mask here just by clicking and painting. My flow's pretty low, it's only on 20, so we're not really seeing that effect changing too much, but there we go, we've just subtly removed that. And now we can see by hovering over this that that area that is red, that is the overlay that is saying this area through here is now being affected by what we've done here, which is brightening things up. So if I just get really aggressive with this, just so you can see, we have brightened this area through here. It was the whole sky, but we removed around those edges, and now it's only that bit that's being affected. And the last thing I want to do is just take away our attention from all this very high contrast gravel here, because it's got so much texture in it, it really grabs our attention. And so I'm going to do that by creating a new mask, and this time a linear gradient, which I'm going to drag in from the side and pull towards the house. And now by rotating, I can make this match the angle of our perspective. And something like that's pretty good. Now any changes we make here will just affect that gravel and then taper off. So if I take the exposure all the way down, you can see how we've darkened this, and that leads our eye in towards the house here. Although I want to darken it, I don't want to do it with the exposure because I find that's just too aggressive. And so I'm going to grab the whites and bring those down, and we're going to bring the contrast down just a little bit as well, maybe drop the exposure a tiny bit, perhaps even boost the blacks as well, and that's just going to reduce that contrast further in those stones. And if we want, we could also go the opposite way with clarity. So obviously by adding clarity, things are really sharp and saying, hey, look at me. But if we grab that clarity and go the other way, it just softens everything up. That obviously looks too fake, but we could just do a little bit of that. And if I come up to the mask itself and toggle the eyeball tool, we can see our before and our after. Our before, very bright, and after is darker and less contrast, and so our eye goes more easily to the brighter part of the frame, the house that has more contrast, and the house is now saying, hey, look at me. I think that overall effect is just a little bit too aggressive, so again, I'm just going to jump into my overall effect slider by clicking that arrow there, and now I can just ease this amount back. I could put it somewhere about 50%. And so we've got the benefit of those changes we just made, but with a more subtle approach, 50%. That's good. So let's look at those changes that those masks have made. I'll toggle the masks off. That's our before, and I'll toggle them on. And that's our after. Okay, let's have a look at where we've come from and where we've got to. I'll press the / key. This is our before, straight out of camera, raw. We've made a lot of changes. Hopefully we've polished a turd. Here is our after. Okay, that's come a long way, hasn't it? We haven't even touched Photoshop, Luminar. We've done this all inside of Lightroom. If I were delivering this to an architectural client, which I am, I would do a lot more finessing on this image. So subscribe to the channel if you want to see more post-production techniques of how you can improve this kind of image even further. But hopefully that Lightroom tutorial has been helpful for you guys. If you're a real estate photographer, this type of approach might be all you need to get this back to your client nice and quickly. You'd be able to smash out an image like this in just a couple of minutes. I recommend building these kind of changes that we did over here into a preset. Then all you're left to do is just straighten the verticals, and if you want to do image specific masking like we did in this one, that should only take you 1, maybe 2 minutes to do that. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If architecture photography and real estate photography is your thing, go ahead and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks so much. Bye bye for now.